Thank you, David, and for the kind invitation. And folks, thank you for taking time from your incredibly busy schedules. Wonderful presentation, Alexander, and Davis and Polly this morning. The other content that you're getting is really, really useful. And David mentioned, my sensitivity to the Parkinson's community, and I want to introduce you to my father, who experienced Parkinson's for about 12, 15 years, and that was for me really, really powerful introduction to Parkinson's. But prior to Dad being diagnosed with Parkinson's, I had been a disability advocate my entire career. I live in the Rocks, and so for you folks from the Pittsburgh area, McKees Rocks is a kind of a roguish community. It's not very far from here. But I grew up and still live on a big family hill, Italian family, the Condeluci family. In fact, it's called Condeluci Hill. I saw some of my friends from the Rocks who are here today that know about Condeluci Hill, and growing up on in a family enclave like that is just an amazing start to life. There's unconditional love and acceptance, regardless of who you are, regardless of how you manifest. You're part of the tribe, as Davis often says in his presentations. And so when I was growing up on the hill as a kid, my best buddy was my cousin Carrie. And Carrie had Down syndrome. I didn't know that she had Down syndrome when we were growing up as kids, because we were inseparable and we played together and we hung around together with the other Condeluci kids. And I didn't realize that Carrie had Down syndrome until I got old enough to go to school and started to go to school. Carrie didn't go to school, even though we were the exact same age. And I remember asking my mom about why doesn't Carrie go to school? And my mom says, well, honey, she's different. And I said, well, what do you mean? I never saw Carrie as different. And she said, yeah, she has a thing called Down syndrome. And so the schools just don't know how to teach kids with Down syndrome, so she doesn't have to go to school. And I remember saying to my mom, can I catch Down syndrome from Carrie so I don't have to go to school either? Because, who likes that school experience? But with that sort of introduction about who's welcomed and who's not welcomed and who's valued and who's not valued and why some people are more valued than other people, really, it was vexing and intrigued me. And so I wanted to be an advocate for people who are left behind, people like Carrie who don't have the kinds of opportunity and possibilities in life that everybody else sort of takes for granted. And so I went off to college and started to study disability advocacy, and so I started my career as an advocate, supporting folks with intellectual disabilities and physical disabilities like cerebral palsy and muscular dystrophy and other kinds of disabilities, and worked for years. In fact, just retired in January from an organization, a nonprofit organization called CLASS, which stands for Community Living and Support Services. And in the course of my career there, met countless families and thousands of people with disabilities, much like Carrie. And we provided supports to try to create bridges to community so that folks with disabilities can take their rightful place in our communities rather than be relegated or segregated from community. Interestingly enough, the bookend for my experience was my dad's Parkinson's diagnosis and then becoming a caretaker for Dad. and recognizing that even though, Parkinson's, the diagnosis for my dad was later in his life. In fact, it was right when he retired, he was diagnosed. But nonetheless, I saw the very same devaluation and marginalization in our communities for Dad as I had experienced when I was a kid with Carrie. And even though the disabilities are very different, the society reaction is really similar. And so one of the things that I began to realize in supporting Dad was that he started to lose his friendships. People that he was connected with, once Dad was diagnosed and started to, show some symptoms, people began to run for the hills. And friends and associates that Dad had in his long career as editor of the McKees Rocks Gazette and worked for the Pittsburgh Press, and he taught printing at Conley Skills Center. He was very active in the community. And then once his Parkinson's unfolded, his community connections began to dilute and diminish. And so I really began to, as a scholar, I began to look in on this. And what I really began to get intrigued with, and actually ended up doing my doctoral work around, was relationships. How they manifest, what they do for us, how we get them, how we lose them, how we might be able to strengthen them. And I got introduced as a graduate student to the construct of social capital. And you heard Davis mentioning earlier today the term social capital. But social capital is a big word. All it really means is the relationships that we have in our lives and the value that those relationships bring to our lives, what they do for us, and how powerful they are. If you just look at this list on this slide, you'll see relationships literally enhance our health. What now medicine knows is what keeps people healthy is not doctors and not medicines, but it's other people who get you to the doctor, who hold your hand when you have a procedure, who are there to support you when you wake up from an operation, and that literally the relationships now have been clearly codified in the literature as a key ingredient to life expectancy and to better health. And it's not just that. Relationships are absolutely tied to happiness. That we talk about wanting to be happy. In fact, in our country, in the Declaration of Independence, we talk about the pursuit of happiness. But the pursuit of happiness is really found through other people, through our friends, through our relationships that we have in life. That life success is tied deeply to relationships. It's not what you know, it's who you know. In fact, that's how people get jobs. That's how people succeed in life. In fact, the theory behind it is called interdependence, right? Where you're strong, someone else might have some needs. Where you're struggling, somebody else might have some strengths offering to you. And so as I began to study social capital, starting to think about how we could keep Dad in the mix, right? We didn't want Dad to become isolated, because I think it was mentioned by a couple of the presenters earlier that social isolation is now considered more lethal than smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. Social isolation. As many Americans die from social isolation every year as all smoke-related diseases and illnesses. That social isolation kills people. It literally is lethal. And so with Dad, part of our passion was to keep Dad active, to keep Dad in the mix, to really look at how can Dad build and establish relationships. And so the things, there are concepts behind social capital that are important. But for our discussion here today, it's really to recognize that relationships are at a couple different levels, right? That we have our covenant relationships, which are our closest relationships. Those are our most intimate relationships. But then we also have relationships with other people that we do things with. And then we have acquaintances that we meet. I'm sure today, as you came to this conference and as we've had some coffee and we're now going to have lunch, and you're meeting new people and you're becoming acquainted, that's how relationships actually start. Sociologists call that bridging, right? How we bridge with other people. And if you stop and think about the notion of bridging, bridging is driven by similarities, by areas that we have of interest. Whenever you meet somebody new, there's always that initial discussion about what do we have in common. Where did you go to school? What kind of music do you like? Any kind of way that we could find connectedness with people. I was just at a conference. I spoke at a conference. I was very, very humbled to be introduced or to be invited to keynote the conference. And so there we were at the Pontifical University in Rome at the Vatican, and we were in this room that was just so majestic in terms of education. It was like stadium style, and there were 500 delegates there. And so I did this presentation on social capital and how important it is for kids that have disabilities. But it's important for everybody. So I finished my talk, and I'm at the coffee urn at the break, and this gentleman comes over, very dignified, very well dressed, and he says, "Dr. Condeluci." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You wonderful presentation. You're from the United States." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Pennsylvania." I said, "Yes." He said, "Pittsburgh." I said, "Yeah, that's my town, Pittsburgh. That's where I'm from." He said, "Do you know the Roselli family?" Don't we get that all the time when we're beginning to establish acquaintanceships? We have some bridge of similarity. This guy was a pediatrician. I did a talk on the importance of relationships and kids. So we had that in common, but then we begin to fish for the other commonality. So when we think about life with Parkinson's and living well with Parkinson's, which is the theme of our conference, and it's what Davis and the Davis-Finney Foundation focuses so much of their attention on. We need to appreciate that there are some hurdles that we have to not let get us down, right? And that was Alexander's point, to be determined, to kind of move forward. But there are some things that we experience with Dad that, I'm sure has happened with folks in this room, where there's so much of a focus on the medical stuff that we literally begin to, we become so narrow-minded about the medical stuff that we begin to become isolated. And then the demands of therapy, the demands of treatment, going to doctor's appointments, all of that stuff begins to take us out of the mix of life, right? And then there are fears. I remember when Dad was diagnosed and his struggle, he began to feel embarrassed with his tremors, right? And so Dad said, "Look," and how I found this out was really serendipitous in that he told me one day that he didn't want to go to church anymore. And now my dad was very faithful man, and very spiritual. He was at church. He went to mass every morning after he retired, right? But then one day he announced he didn't want to go to mass anymore. And I said, "Dad, why? What's the problem?" I said, it's not an imposition for me to take you to Mass. And in fact, it's good for me to hear the good news on a regular basis. And he said, no. He said, it's the medicine. He said, this new medicine they've given me makes me pee all the time. And he said, I don't want to disrupt the Mass. I don't want to have to get up and, go to the bathroom in the middle of the Mass. And I said, well, Dad, we have at our agency, we have these things called Texas catheters. Okay? We can roll that bad boy up underneath your pants and a little tube. Nobody will see it. And there's a bag down by your ankle. And you could pee anytime you want. You could pee during the homily. You won't have to get up and go pee. Right? And Dad said, no. He said, I'd just rather not go. And what it actually was not the peeing. That's not what was causing Dad not to want to go to church. It was embarrassment. It was the notion that other people were moving away from him. It was the other people were kind of looking and saying, oh my God, look at poor Mr. Condeluci. All that extraneous stuff that was causing Dad to want to bail out of something that was really important, both internally and externally, for him to stay engaged with. So all of these kinds of things can get in the way, yet once our disability has been identified, the more important action is to maintain those relationships, to grow our social capital rather than to retreat from things. So in my work, in my practice, both at the university as well as some trainings I do, we really think about what are the things that can cause people or allow people to build more social capital. By the way, here's a quote from Robert Putnam. Robert Putnam is a Harvard sociologist. He studied social capital up one side and down the other. And he says, as many people die from social isolation as from all smoke-related diseases. Powerful, powerful stuff. And that we also know that friendship is really important for all kinds of reasons. I love this quote from Cicero, right? Friendship makes prosperity more shining, and it lessens adversity by dividing it and sharing it. Isn't that a beautiful, beautiful thought? So we have these ups and downs of life, but through our relationships, we maintain this very powerful notion. So to keep social capital or to build social capital, there's a couple of things I want to recommend that you think about. And I've written about this in Davis Finney Foundation has an incredible manual. And I have a chapter in that manual about maintaining and retaining relationships. But step one, think about things you like. Let me use my dad as a quick example for these. My dad was a jazz man. He was a jazz bassist as a young man. And he was also a writer. And so he got involved with Downbeat magazine as a young man to write about jazz. And so Dad would cover all the jazz greats that would come to Pittsburgh. Ella Fitzgerald and Duke Ellington, and they would come into town, and Dad, as a writer for Downbeat magazine, would go meet them. Sometimes he brought those jazz greats up to Condeluci Hill to have spaghetti because they couldn't go to certain restaurants because of the segregation and some of the things that were happening at that time. So one of the things we thought as Dad's Parkinson's started to take him, as he started to want to retreat from the mix, we began to say, well, Dad, let's see if we can use your interest in jazz. So step one, we focused on the jazz, and then we began to say, is there a place, a generic place where people gather to listen to jazz? And we found the Pittsburgh Jazz Society that meets in Oakland at Jackson's at the Holiday Inn every Sunday. Right? And so we began to think, well, let's go. And Dad, I don't know. He said, come on, I love jazz too, so you and I go. So we went to the Jazz Society meeting. And when we got there, some people began, back away because Dad was tremoring, and, at that point he was getting, really needing more mobility assistance. So some people were backing away. So what we then did is we looked at this notion of the gatekeeper. I wanted to find somebody in the Jazz Society who basically could introduce Dad. So I went over to the president of the society. I said, hey, we're new members. My dad used to write for Downbeat magazine. He interviewed all the greats, Stanley Tarantine. He interviewed, Wes Montgomery. He knew these folks. And the president said, whoa, wow. So he began to introduce my dad to some of the other members of the society. And what began to happen is because the president was introducing Dad to the other jazz society members, they began to say, whoa, this guy's really very cool. He has a great experience. And the Parkinsons didn't matter anymore to them. Right? So that's what we call macro change. When we change the perception of other people about a condition that we live with. That's already happened in your family, macro change, right? As your family members have begun to realize, okay, Dad has Parkinson's, so he shakes a little, he has to pee all the time. No big deal, right? So the notion of macro change, we really want to see that happen in the greater community. Because although we get a lot of support from each other, life is broader than that. And we have to educate the rest of the world about the fact that even though people have Parkinson's, that all these other things that they have to offer are being denied, and we want to maintain and retain those. So let me use a jazz reference, and let me close this out. Friendship is like jazz. It's really hard to define it, but you know it when you got it, right? You know it when you got it. And so thinking about your own social networks, like who you still see and who you connect with, maintaining those are really important. But beyond that, growing new relationships become equally important. And there's no failure except in no longer trying, right? When people begin to bail out and say, I don't want to do that anymore, then that's really when we see some failures. So let me just finish with this quote from Albert Schweitzer. Schweitzer famously said, what we do with our lives individually is not what determines whether we're a success. What determines whether we're a success is how we affect the lives of other people. And let me couple this with a story. As Dad's needs began to get more intense, we began to provide the attendant care. And one of my jobs, I just lovingly accepted it, was to give Dad a bath, right, every night. So on Condeluci Hill, he lived right across the street. I'd go over every night, give Dad a bath. And so one evening, I was bathing my dad. Now, I've given lots of baths. I've been a disability advocate my entire life, so I know how to give people baths. If anybody needs a bath, call me, and I'll help with that. Right? So there we are in the tub, and I'm washing Dad, and Dad started to cry. And I wasn't sure, I had seen my dad cry a lot when he was a younger man, but usually it was tears of joy. These were different types of tears. I didn't know what to do, and so I said, well, Dad, no crying in the bathtub. What are you crying for? I said, and he said, I didn't want this for you. And I said, what? He said, I should be taking care of you. I didn't want you to have to take care of me. And I said, Dad, this is an honor for me to do. This is not an imposition. You did take care of me. Now it's my turn to take care of you. And that if I have to have somebody help me with that, I hope that my sons are able to do. So this is just like the circle of life. And then Dad paused and he said something that made me cry. He said, I don't want you to remember me like this. Very powerful. So I didn't know how to deal with that. But then I realized at that point, my dad was actually giving me a gift. He was giving me an opportunity to tell him right there, right then, at the bathtub, how much he means to me, how much he means to our family, how important he has been and will be in the future. And so we had this moment, we hugged and we kissed and a couple weeks later, he passed. And I got to tell that story during his, when I did the eulogy at Mass. Because at the end of our road, whenever that happens, however that might happen for any of us, the most important thing is really how we've impacted other people. Warren Buffett said, a successful life is answering just one question. And that question is, do the people you care for love you back? Right? And it really begins to set the tone for us to think about the relationships in our life. Because the more relationships we have, the more impact we make in life. And so I really salute you being here, opening yourself up to all this wonderful stuff that David and the foundation has prepared for us for today. But as you leave, my final parting message is maintain those relationships, extend them, because not only are they going to be good for you, they're going to be instructive and help other people be better people who are around you. Thanks so much. Let's have a good lunch. Thank you.